Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. Join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Today we want to look at something, and it's been quite a while. That's why I wanted to bring it up, because I know that we have regular followers, and you might say, I remember that Axel has talked about this before. But for anybody who has joined us more recently, I want to bring this topic up. And I don't know how many of you are not just interested in real estate, but you're also kind of consuming information about real estate, for example, on TV, like HGTV, for example, has all kinds of different series on TV talking about all kinds of aspects of real estate. And there are other channels and other TV channels and stuff, and even YouTube and so forth, that have all kinds of things about real estate and real estate investing. And so two things that have been kind of contrasted with each other in the past and even today is, should I actually buy and find a property to buy so I can basically rent it out? Or should I find a property that is in need of renovation and fix it up and then sell it, which is called flipping? So today's topic is basically, is renting or flipping better, and in which way is the one better than the other? So if we're looking at renting, you buy the property and you have basically two things going for you, and maybe a little bit more than two if you really think about it in the longer term. So you buy the property, and with inflation and everything else going on, over the years, the property will increase in value, at least at the rate of inflation. And if we look historically for the last 20, 30, 50, 80 years, the average increase in value pretty much across the board is about 3%. Now, if you then, on top of that, happen to be in an area where you think there could be a lot of additional economic development, right? Like if I'm comparing, for example, some investments that I have in Dayton, Ohio, versus some investments that I could have made at the same time in Columbus, Ohio. I went for Dayton because at the time the properties were a little cheaper, but now, about 8 years later, when I look at it, Columbus had a much more vigorous economic development than Dayton. So yes, my Dayton properties increased in value, but the Columbus properties increased in value even more because of all that additional economic development in that community. So you can have your 3%, you might have even more. And then obviously, if you rent the property, your costs, meaning like your mortgage for 30 years and your insurance and your property taxes, the one thing that fluctuates and gets higher is property taxes, but most of the rest remains the same. And your rent go up also with inflation, but also with supply and demand, right? And interest rates for properties went up a lot from like 3% to 5, 6, 7%, then suddenly more and more people who would otherwise try to buy a house cannot afford it anymore, and they need to rent if they want a house, right? So that means lots of people want to rent, very few houses available, obviously rent goes up. So you have your average increase in rent, and then you have other circumstances like supply and demand that bring rent up. So as a long-term investor into rental properties, you have the increase in the value of the house and the increase in the rent income, which means the increase in cash flow. And one additional benefit you have is the government basically appreciates if you are an investor and you provide shelter for the public. And so they allow you to write off, or what's called depreciate, your purchase price over the years. Now, if we contrast that to flipping, you found a house in a nice neighborhood and you decide this house is perfect if it were fixed up and put into good shape and modernized. So you get that house for a price that is much lower than a house that's already finished that you can buy and rent right away. But you also have to put in the money to get it actually in shape. Now, one of the problems with that is oftentimes that money that you need to do the renovation, you typically cannot finance. Most of the time, you can only finance the current value of the house. Let's say you find a house that would be worth $200,000 after renovation. That's called the after renovation value, or ARV. But right now, when it is appraised, it's only considered to be worth $125,000. So you cannot get a mortgage for more than about 80% of the $125,000. So maybe a $100,000 mortgage, and you would still have to put $20,000 to $25,000 down. But then you're looking, let's say, at a $50,000 renovation. That $50,000 has to come from somewhere. So either you get what's called a hard money lender or a private money lender, which is quite expensive to pay for the renovation costs, or you have to pay it out of pocket. So that's already one disadvantage versus the other case that we just went through, because you have much, much higher out of pocket expenses. Okay, so now let's say it takes you 6 to 9 months to do the renovation, get everything permitted, the house is perfect, you put it on the market, and you actually sell it for those $200,000. So you bought it for 120, you renovated it for 50,000, so now it's 170, and you sold it for 200, so you made $30,000 profit. You obviously get your $20,000 down payment back, and you had a little bit of cost to pay basically for the loan for the, let's say, 9 months. So your net, let's say, income that you made is $25,000. When you compare that to the long-term property value, you would not sell the house, a long-term purchase investment. You wouldn't sell that after a year, but even if you did, your $120,000 house, if it increased by 3%, like we said on average, that's only like $4,000, right? So you would get those $4,000, and you might have a little bit of rent income. So you may have made, if you're lucky, something like $3,000 on rent income after everything else is paid. So your total is $7,000 in the one case and $25,000 in the other case. So from a short-term perspective, the flipping, getting the money when everything works out perfectly, is making you more money. Now, obviously, when you renovate a property, you have way, way more time invested and your own money invested than buying something that's already finished and you just rent it and have it managed by property management. The other issue that you're getting into that is also to consider is if you find this rental property and you estimated that the renovation would be 50,000, but while you're renovating, and this is actually happening in almost every HGTV show that you watch, you will see they always discover something that was unanticipated. Well, if that happens to you and it takes another $10,000 to fix that, now your $25,000 gain is down to $15,000. Right? So that's something to consider. And then the other part that you would have to consider is it possible that something happens in the market? Now, in the past, we had relatively stable markets. But let's just say you find this property that looks really good in May 2022, and you want to renovate and get it all done and sell it in the spring of 2023, just when the market is in full swing, everybody is looking for new houses and so forth. Well, that would be nice, but here's what happened in that exact time frame between May 2022 and spring of 2023. Interest rates went for mortgages on houses went from about 3.5% to 7.5%. Now, suddenly, all the people who could afford that $200,000 house for 3.5, 4.5, maybe even 5%, but not at 7.5%, so you can't sell it. Now you have to ask yourself, okay, well, if I don't sell it, I have to pay more and more months for the money that I borrowed to get this thing finished, right? How long can you do this? Every month that goes by, you're probably losing $1,500 on that house, right? And so if you had that extra renovation, you were at $15,000, the next month you're down at 13.5, the next one you're down, you're at 12, the next one you're down, you're at 10.5, and so forth, right? So if something like that happens, and I admit this is not very typical, but it did happen just a year and a half ago, this is also a risk that you're carrying. And if you only own it for 9 months or 12 months, you don't get the depreciation and all those kind of things that the long-term owner would get. So the chance to make money much faster and significantly more is there for flipping, but it's also much, much risky. And you have to keep in mind, when you're done, let's say everything worked perfect. You bought it for 120, renovated for 50, sold it for 200, got your 25,000 after everything is done in the pocket. Now, if you want to continue to be an investor, you also have to find another property to do the same thing over again. That's the other thing, short-term versus long-term, because the long-term investor who buys the house to rent it out, they don't really have any consideration for the next 10, 15, 20 years to ever do anything other than just keep it rented, keep it maintained, collect the rent. Those are the things to consider It does not mean that the one is better than the other. It's just different. And in my opinion, short-term or flipping is considerably more risky. But if you do everything right, it's also considerably more rewarding. I'm pretty conservative. I don't like the risk, so I rather buy the property and keep it forever and have my benefits that way. But it's your decision. I just wanted to do the service again, since it's been at least a year or longer since we touched on this. I wanted to make you aware, especially with this relatively recent development in interest rates. So that's it for today. Be well and stay safe, and I talk to you tomorrow.